The reason the prairies are probably one of the most severely damaged ecosystems in North America is because of the collisions between humans and a wide range of animals, from the famous giant bison to tiny rodents, as well as agriculture, ranching, hunting, urbanization, and other human activities. All of this caused the once thriving landscape to deteriorate over a significant portion of North America. The prairies no longer resemble the one they once did. It appears that salvation lies in altering how we use nature for our own gain. In addition, people began letting small dogs run loose on the altered prairies. No, not those dogs. In the past, there were a lot of prairie dogs in North America. They lived in the west from Canada to Mexico. It's difficult to determine how anyone counted prairie dogs before 1800, but there is information. How did such a small animal end up being the key to rescuing a legendary ecosystem, implying that over 5 billion of them roamed the western regions? Why did 1800 become a pivotal year? You can probably assume that European settlers arrived. In fact, the history of practically every animal species in North America is strongly linked to them. Hunting prairie dogs for their fur isn't the reason why their numbers declined. What actually made? Since prairie dogs thrive in the fabled North American prairies, the difference was that as farming and ranching expanded, people began converting that area into farmland, leaving them with fewer and fewer living spaces. When it came to livestock farming, prairie dogs truly got on people's nerves. Their homes are burrows that they dig in the ground. These can have many chambers, each serving a different purpose, such as a nursery, a place to sleep, or a place to hibernate. Of course, these underground homes are a means of avoiding predators, but the ranchers weren't particularly bothered by this. Instead, they were more concerned about something else. Prairie dog burrows are, a cow or a horse could easily step into one of the holes strewn throughout the fields and sustain injuries severe enough to cause death. In addition, it was frequently claimed that those small prairie dogs were serious grass eaters, and grass ultimately provides food for the herd, so yes, it became a problem, and ranchers began actively eradicating prairie dogs, both by routine shooting and by using poison. But that wasn't the end of the prairie dogs' problems, because in 1900, rats brought over from Asia by trading ships spread the plague to North American rodents, which can quickly wipe out entire colonies, sometimes within a week. This first caused a significant decline in prairie dog populations. Numbers by themselves, and secondly, encouraged people to hunt them down even more aggressively because of the growing fear that the unfortunate rodents could infect humans and livestock with the plague. It's important to note that the mass eradication of these animals in North America continued until the end of the 20th century, and in many instances, the authorities actually contributed to that. One of the most notable instances is South Dakota in the 1980s, when a state order poisoned over 494,000 acres of prairie dog land, which was home to one of the largest surviving populations in the United States. Lately, in addition to all the other issues small animals face, there has been the constant. The number of prairie dogs naturally decreased as a result of the spread of cities and suburbs, which left less and less room for them to live. Ultimately, of the 5 billion prairie dogs that roamed North America in the 1800s, between 96 and 98% had been poisoned, shot, or driven out by the 2000s. Their habitat consequently decreased to roughly 5% due to farming and urban sprawl. But the most distressing thing for these small animals is that their intentional eradication by humans was completely needless. Research has shown that cows and horses hardly ever break their legs due to prairie dogs. However, only 23 of the nearly 500 cases of livestock infection since 1949 were traced back to prairie dogs. Scientists came to the conclusion that the plague is equally dangerous for these rodents, who are not carriers but rather victims of the disease spread by fleas. As a result, prairie dogs were accidentally eradicated almost entirely. Let's move on to Arizona, where in the past one of the prairie dog species, the black-tailed ones, was common throughout the local prairies but has been systematically poisoned since the 1960s. At the same time, people realized that prairies without prairie dogs frequently face serious problems. In 2008, Arizona Game and Fish, or AGFD, BLM statens, and a number of private landowners began a reintroduction project in southern Arizona, where the prairies were once teeming with life after it became evident that this species is essential to the prairie ecosystem. Following their release from New Mexico, approximately 500 black-tailed prairie dogs traveled to Arizona from New Mexico. According to project participants involved in the restoration, there are currently at least 300 of these dogs in southern Arizona. The species now occupies roughly 36 acres of land that have been eroding because of the lack of. In order to understand what can be accomplished in Arizona by increasing the number of prairie dogs, let's travel a little southeast to the state of Chihuahua in Mexico. There used to be a lot of prairie dogs there, and the population recovery is well underway, but there is still more to come because the dogs will be breeding. The mosquito. a plant that can find water even where there isn't much of it, took over part of the state's land in 1987 when the prairie dogs were nearly extinct. This ability comes from its roots, which can go deep. However, the same culling through hunting and poisoning also occurred, along with habitat destruction from agriculture. Large areas of the Chihuahua State prairies into deserts and semi-deserts, which significantly decreased biodiversity. Then the altered areas that had previously lost nearly all of their prairie dogs started to regain them because of the shrub's ability to draw small animals that eat the surrounding grasses. Due to the efforts of a few committed individuals, the mosquito eventually vanished. Coincidentally, prairie dogs dislike the shrub because it obscures their ability to see the horizon, which allows them to identify potential predators. As a result, they attempt to remove it as much as they can. It has been reported that within a year, prairie dogs are able to destroy the majority of these plants, and the prairie dog, along with the mosquito, has caused the formerly arid lands to vanish. Large tracts of land have been transformed back into prairies, and these prairies are home to a vast array of animals and insects, as observers of the changes that have occurred in Mexico have noted shortly after in an area where once golden eagles, a bird that is said to be uncommon in Mexico, especially in Chihuahua, appeared after the appearance of prairie dogs. When researchers drove through the area, which was changing from desert to what now appears to be a prairie, they were able to see more than 20 of those eagles in one day because prairie dogs are keystone species, which means they have an impact on the ecosystem that is far greater than their own lifeless areas may gradually return to their original prairie state. This is true both visually and in terms of biodiversity. Numbers in summary, there aren't many of them, but they have the power to completely transform everything. That's what happened in Mexico, and it will or has already happened in Arizona's species recovery area. Regretfully, there isn't much information available on the reintroduction process there, but based on Mexico, we can assume that Arizona will experience the same thing. Positive changes now, let's return to the mosquito that prairie dogs dislike. It's important to note that the relationship between the shrubs and the prairie dogs is not over yet. They simply cannot tolerate any trees or excessively long grass, which is why their habitat is made up of prairies and meadows. Grow in such places because young animals destroy them before they can mature into something more robust and stable. In addition, prairie dogs dig burrows that promote grass growth and replenish the topsoil with rich minerals and other nutrients, which scientists say is essential for soil quality and even. According to various sources, approximately 150 different animal species rely on prairie dogs, which is why they have been driven out of their habitats. In other words, when there are prairie dogs, other animals appear, but when there aren't any, the other prairie inhabitants are either totally or nearly entirely absent. Do you know about the fabled American bison? They were also hunted to extinction by humans, but this time for their fur and everything else they have to offer. Scientists have discovered that bison are more likely to graze on prairie dog grazing lands where you may also see pronghorns and mule deer. The fact that prairie dogs dig burrows that could break their limbs doesn't bother them at all. Speaking of burrows, other species like to live in them. For example, a golden-mantled brown squirrel may decide to make a prairie dog burrow its home. This is an owl, a burrowing owl, which prefers to simply settle in the prairie dog's burrows rather than dig. Additionally, the biodiversity of the region where the prairie dogs reside rises because many predators prefer to prey on rodents. For instance, the black-footed ferret frequently stands out because it consumes 90% prairie dogs. The black-footed ferret was declared completely extinct in 1979 due to a decline in prairie dog populations, but a remnant wild population was found in Wyoming in 1981. From 1991 to 2009, there were vigorous attempts to reintroduce the ferret in the US, Canada, and Mexico, and by 2015, there were more than 200 individuals in 18 populations. After years of research, ecologists in South Dakota, Arizona, and Wyoming determined that restoring the black-footed ferret population would require first restoring the prairie dog population. For this reason, in many places, the reintroduction of the stars of our video today was the first step, and the ferrets were only introduced as they eat them. In addition to ferrets, prairie dogs are the primary food source for species such as coyotes, swift foxes, golden eagles, red-tailed hawks, American badgers, and swift foxes. If prairie dogs are present, you'll undoubtedly see one or possibly all of these species. It's also important to note that these tiny prairie inhabitants are extremely significant. Ecologists conducted an experimental project on reintroducing prairie dogs, and they discovered that many species that you won't find them on nearby meadows where there are no prairie dogs eat them. However, even those species that use burrows but don't eat our prairie dog heroes will still prefer areas where prairie dogs live. The Sevieta National Wildlife Refuge in Sacramento County, New Mexico, is home to 22 acres of grasslands where prairie dogs were released. This region is indicated in blue. Adjacent to it are identical meadows where no species was introduced. Birds of prey and badgers are the species that follow their favorite prey, ignoring grasslands where it wasn't present. These species, which are indicated in yellow, appear almost immediately on the same land as rabbits and burrowing owls. This indicates how strongly they feel the need to establish themselves in burrows that have already been dug. Scientists concluded that prairie dogs are essential to restoring the prairie ecosystem. Now let's move to Colorado, to a location that is somewhat unusual for today's topic, the U.S. Army's Chemical Depot in PBLO. There are 2613 tons of mustard agent and roughly 780,000 munitions were stored, accounting for about 7% of. The U.S. original chemical materials stockpile was destroyed in the spring of 2015, and the work was completed in 2023. Despite this, it seems like a reason why the biodiversity in this area shouldn't be that rich. After all, stockpiles like that are serious business because they can have a significant impact on the environment. According to the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Chemical Depot is home to some of Colorado's oldest unspoiled short-grass prairie habitats. In addition, a variety of wild animals such as burrowing owls, foxes, hawks, golden eagles, coyotes, and badgers can be found there. Determine which of the animals on that list we already saw in today's video. Yes, prairie dogs are responsible for the survival of some local wildlife, which either finds a home in their burrows or becomes food. Surprisingly, the problem isn't warehouse chemicals, but rather a plague outbreak in 2015 and 2016 that severely affected local species. Of course, prairie dogs were the first to suffer in 2019. In order to restore historic populations of this important species, a massive project was started to relocate prairie dogs. It was completed in 2023 and involved cooperation from the U.S. Army Colorado Parks and Wildlife Department, the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Wildlife Service, the Colorado Department of Transportation, and the Prairie Dog Coalition. The participants were trapping prairie dogs from both privately owned and PBLO Chemical Depot-owned land, then moving the key species to a designated area. Naturally, as with other projects, some of the individuals who left after the majority of the prairie dogs were eradicated have returned along with the local. Prairies have become healthier, but that is still insufficient for the project team. The primary objective is to restore the black-footed ferrets, whose diet, let's not forget, consists of 90% prairie dogs. Hopefully, everything will work out. It's also important to note that scientists are interested in prairie dogs for other reasons than just the fact that they're a keystone species, but they also bark. Yes, the creatures you see on your screen today have some of the most sophisticated vocal communication systems in the animal kingdom. Consider this: after extensive research, scientists have discovered that prairie dogs use a sophisticated vocal communication system to identify particular predators. If you believe that the animal's response to a predator's approach is always to dive into a burrow that isn't even close, consider the prairie dog's reaction when they receive an alarm signal that a hawk is swooping down toward the colony. Calls actually carry detailed information about the predator's size, speed, and location. In the event of a coyote threat, prairie dogs move toward the burrow entrances and stand just outside, keeping an eye on the predator, while those inside come out to stand and watch. When a human appears close to the colony, the animals in its flight path all dive into their burrows, while those outside the path simply stand and watch. Every member of the colony immediately hurried into their burrows without pausing to observe, and this behavior is entirely reasonable. Years of extinction are demonstrating their impact on how prairie dogs respond to people, and it doesn't even matter that the important species currently been acknowledged and is actively prepared to restore the arid plains, returning to their former state.